The crystal chandeliers of the Montgomery estate cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as 26-year-old Elena Martinez pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway. Her worn sneakers made barely a whisper against the expensive Italian tile. She'd learned long ago how to move like a ghost through these palatial rooms. Behind her, 4-year-old Sophie clutched her stuffed rabbit, her wide brown eyes taking in the opulence that surrounded them with the innocent wonder only a child could muster. "Mama, is this a castle?" Sophie whispered, her tiny voice echoing slightly in the vast corridor. Elena smiled, though her heart ached. "Something like that, Mija. But remember what I told you, stay close and stay quiet, okay?" It was supposed to be her day off, but Mrs. Chun, the head housekeeper, had called in a panic. The Montgomery family was hosting an engagement party that evening, and 2 cleaners had called in sick. Elena needed this job desperately. The pay was good, better than anywhere else she'd worked, and it came with health insurance that covered Sophie's asthma medication. So when Mrs. Chun asked, Elena said yes, even though it meant bringing Sophie along to the estate for the first time. The Montgomery mansion was a monument to wealth, 20,000 square feet of Georgian architecture perched on 5 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood of Greenwich, Connecticut. Elena had been cleaning here for 8 months, always efficient, always invisible. That was how people like her survived in places like this. She was polishing the grand piano in the music room when she heard the voices approaching, high-pitched laughter that made her instinctively tense. She recognized that laugh. It belonged to Vivian Ashford, the fiancée of James Montgomery, the 32-year-old heir to the Montgomery Fortune 500 empire. "Oh, James, darling, I simply must show you the menu I've planned for the honeymoon in Santorini," Vivian's voice rang out, saccharine sweet and dripping with privilege. Elena quickly moved to gather her supplies, hoping to slip out before they entered. But Sophie, curious as always, had wandered to the piano bench and was staring at the keys with fascination. "Sophie, come here," Elena whispered urgently, but it was too late. Vivian swept into the room in a cloud of Chanel No. 5, her designer dress probably worth more than Elena made in 6 months. Behind her came James Montgomery, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression one of polite disinterest as Vivian chattered on about floral arrangements. Vivian stopped mid-sentence when she spotted Elena and Sophie. Her perfectly microbladed eyebrows rose dramatically. "Excuse me," Vivian's voice could have frozen water. "What is that child doing in here? This room is off-limits during party preparations. The piano alone is worth more than—" She paused, looking Elena up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Well, more than some people make in a lifetime." Elena felt her cheeks burn. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Ashford. I was just finishing." "It's Miss Ashford," Vivian corrected sharply. "And you should know better than to bring a child to work. What if she damages something? Look at her, touching the piano bench with those grubby little hands." Sophie's hands weren't grubby. Elena had made sure she washed them, but the little girl recoiled as if she'd been slapped, her eyes welling with tears. "Sophie, come here, baby," Elena said softly, reaching for her daughter. But Sophie, in her confusion and hurt, did something unexpected. She climbed onto the piano bench. "Get her down from there," Vivian shrieked. "That's a Steinway Model D concert grand. Do you have any idea, James? Do something." James Montgomery had been silent until now, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, something extraordinary happened. Sophie's small fingers touched the keys. What came forth wasn't the random plinking of a child. It was the opening bars of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, No. 2, complex, nuanced, and played with a sensitivity that silenced the room instantly. Elena's heart stopped. She had known Sophie was gifted, had seen her daughter's obsession with any piano they passed in shopping malls or hotel lobbies, had watched her pick out melodies after hearing them just once. But they couldn't afford a piano, couldn't afford lessons. Elena had assumed it was just a phase, a childish fascination. This was something else entirely. Sophie played for 30 seconds, her small hands moving across the keys with impossible grace, before she stopped and looked back at her mother with a bright smile. "Pretty, Mama?" The silence that followed was deafening. Vivian's face had gone from red to white and back to red again. That's impossible. She must have, it's a trick. Some kind of recording." "There's no recording," James said quietly, his voice cutting through Vivian's sputtering. He was staring at Sophie with an expression of pure astonishment. She'd just played one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. From memory. "Don't be ridiculous, James," Vivian snapped, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "She's just a maid's daughter. She probably pressed some buttons or—" "I know music, Vivian," James interrupted, his tone firmer than Elena had ever heard him speak to his fiancée. "My mother was a concert pianist. I grew up with that piano. What this child just did is extraordinary." Vivian's expression turned ugly. "Oh, please. If you can't play, there's no food in this world that will make up for it. This is clearly some kind of scheme. Next, the mother will be asking for money, claiming her daughter is some kind of prodigy, begging for lessons or— That's enough." James's voice was sharp now, commanding. He walked toward the piano, toward Sophie, who watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. Elena stepped forward protectively, placing herself between her daughter and this stranger, no matter how wealthy he was. "Sophie, come down now. We're leaving." But James held up a hand. "Please. Wait." He looked at Elena directly for what might have been the first time since she'd started working here. Really looked at her. "What's your daughter's name?" "Sophie," Elena said quietly, her chin lifting slightly despite her fear. "And we're very sorry for the disturbance. It won't happen again." "Has she had lessons?" Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Lessons? When she was working 2 jobs just to keep them fed and housed. When Sophie's shoes were from the thrift store and her own coat had holes she'd mended 3 times. "No," she said simply. James looked stunned. He turned back to Sophie, who was still sitting on the bench, looking confused by all the adult emotions swirling around her. "Sophie," he said gently, "can you play something else?" Before Elena could object, Sophie brightened. "Mama sings a song. I can play it." And she did. She played the melody to Clair de Lune, which Elena had hummed to her as a lullaby since she was a baby. It wasn't perfect. There were mistakes, hesitations, but the essential beauty was there, pulled from memory and feeling alone. When she finished, Sophie looked at Vivian with the brutal honesty of a 4-year-old. "Did I do good? Are you still mad?" Vivian's face contorted. "This is absurd. James, we have a party to prepare for. Send them away." But James wasn't looking at Vivian anymore. He was looking at Elena with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "How long has she been able to do this?" he asked. Elena swallowed hard. "I don't know. Maybe always? She hears things once and can play them back. I thought it was normal, just child's play." "It's not normal," James said softly. "It's a gift. A rare one." Vivian made a sound of disgust. "This is ridiculous. I won't stand here and watch you fawn over the help's child. Either they leave or I do." The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Elena didn't wait to see which choice James would make. She scooped Sophie into her arms, grabbed her cleaning cart with her free hand, and hurried toward the door, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall in front of these people. Behind her, she heard Vivian's triumphant voice. "Really, darling, you're too kind-hearted for your own good. People like that, they'll take advantage any way they can." Elena's hands shook as she pushed the cart down the hallway. Sophie buried her face in her mother's neck. "Did I do something bad, Mama?" the little girl whispered. "No, baby," Elena whispered back, her voice breaking. "You did something beautiful. You always do. But as they left the mansion, Elena's mind was racing. She'd seen the way Vivian looked at them, with contempt and suspicion. She'd probably complained to Mrs. Chen. Elena might lose this job, and then what would they do? She didn't know that back in a music room, James Montgomery stood alone, Vivian having stormed off in a huff. He was staring at the piano, replaying in his mind what he'd just witnessed. His mother had been a gifted pianist, had toured internationally before she married his father. She died when James was 12, but she taught him enough that he recognized true talent when he saw it. What that child had done wasn't just talent. It was something approaching genius. And the look in her mother's eyes, not greedy or scheming as Vivian had suggested, but frightened and fiercely protective, that had struck something deep in his chest. James had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Money, connections, status. His engagement to Vivian had been as much a business arrangement as a romantic one. Their families moved in the same circles, shared the same values, the same world. But when was the last time something had genuinely surprised him? Moved him? He pulled out his phone and made a call. Richard, I need you to look into one of our housekeeping staff. Elena Martinez. I need to know everything, her background, her situation, especially anything about her daughter's education. When he hung up, James couldn't quite explain the feeling in his chest. It felt almost like hope. The engagement party that evening was everything Vivian had orchestrated it to be, a glittering display of wealth and status. 200 guests mingled in the Montgomery ballroom, champagne flowed freely, and a string quartet played tastefully in the corner. James smiled at the right moments, shook the right hands, accepted congratulations from business associates and family friends who all seemed to blur together into one homogeneous mass of privilege. But his mind kept drifting back to a 4-year-old girl with worn clothes and magic in her fingertips. You seem distracted, darling, Vivian murmured beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. She'd changed into a stunning emerald gown that perfectly complemented the enormous diamond on her finger. Still thinking about that ridiculous scene earlier? James forced himself to focus on his fiancée. Vivian Ashford was objectively beautiful, tall, blonde, impeccably bred. Their mothers had been friends. Their engagement announcement had made the society pages. On paper, she was perfect. It wasn't ridiculous, he said carefully. That child has genuine talent. Vivian's laugh was like wind chimes. Pretty, but ultimately hollow. Oh, James, you're so sweet. But really, we both know what that was about. The mother probably trained the girl to play a few party tricks, hoping to catch the attention of someone with money. It's a tale as old as time. She'd never seen the girl before today, James pointed out. Mrs. Chen confirmed that Elena never brings her daughter to work. Exactly my point, Vivian said triumphantly. Today of all days? Our engagement party. Come on, darling. You're brilliant with business, but you can be so naive about people sometimes. Before James could respond, his father appeared, Gerald Montgomery, 65, and still commanding in his tuxedo. Son, the Hendersons want to discuss the merger. 5 minutes in my study. Business. Always business. James excused himself from Vivian and followed his father, the conversation about Sophie already being dismissed in her mind, he was sure. But not in his. The next morning, Richard Chen, no relation to the housekeeper, but the Montgomery family's private investigator and security consultant, arrived at James's office with a folder. That was fast, James said, gesturing for Richard to sit. You said it was important. Richard opened the folder. Elena Martinez, 26 years old. Born in Queens to immigrant parents from El Salvador. Father died when she was 15, construction accident. Mother passed 3 years ago from cancer. Elena worked 2 jobs while getting her associate's degree in early childhood education from community college. She was engaged briefly to a man named David Chen. Related to Mrs. Chen? James interrupted. Her nephew. The engagement ended when Elena got pregnant. David wanted her to terminate the pregnancy.
She refused.
He left. No contact since, no child support. Elena's been raising Sophie alone. James felt a surge of anger toward a man he'd never met. Go on. She worked at a daycare for 2 years, but the pay wasn't enough. Started taking cleaning jobs on the side. Your family's estate is one of 3 places she works. She's been here 8 months. Perfect record. Never a complaint. Lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Stamford, rent-controlled. No car, takes the bus. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Richard pulled out another sheet. Here's where it gets interesting. I made some calls to the daycare, where she used to work. They remember Sophie well. One of the teachers I spoke to said the child was remarkable, advanced language skills, incredible memory, and yes, an unusual affinity for music. There's a piano in the daycare's common room. According to the teacher, Sophie would spend every free moment there, picking out melodies she'd heard. Any formal assessment? James asked.
No.
The teacher suggested it to Elena, but Richard glanced at his notes, and I quote, she said she couldn't afford testing, and what would be the point anyway? She couldn't afford lessons or a piano, so why torture herself knowing what her daughter could do, but never have the chance to pursue? James felt something twist in his chest. The resignation in that statement, the quiet grief of a mother who recognized her child's gift but lacked the resources to nurture it. There's more, Richard continued. I did some discreet checking. Elena's been on the waiting list for subsidized housing for 18 months. She's also been putting aside money, about $50 a month, in a savings account marked Sophie's Education. At this rate, she'll have enough for 1 semester at a community college in 14 years. James stood and walked to the window of his corner office, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. From here, the world looked orderly, manageable. But down there, people like Elena were fighting battles he'd never had to imagine. What's your assessment? He asked Richard. Of what? The situation or the woman? Both. Richard was quiet for a moment. The situation is what you'd expect. Single mother, working class, doing everything she can for her kid. As for Elena Martinez herself, she's clean, James. No angles, no schemes. If anything, she's been trying to stay invisible. The other housekeepers say she never asks for anything, never complains, works harder than anyone else. Mrs. Chun says she's the most reliable person on staff. And the daughter's talent? I'm not a music expert, but I made a call to Juilliard, carefully, no names. Described what you witnessed. The professor I spoke to said if a 4-year-old can play Chopin after only hearing it, without lessons, that's not just talent. That's the kind of thing they might see once in a generation. James turned back to Richard. I want to help them. Richard's expression didn't change. I figured.
How?
I don't know yet. But that child deserves a chance to develop her gift. And her mother deserves not to have to choose between paying rent and nurturing her daughter's talent. Vivian's not going to like this, Richard observed mildly. James thought about his fiancée's reaction yesterday, the contempt in her voice when she'd called Sophie just a maid's daughter. Vivian doesn't have to like it, he said quietly. This isn't about her. But it was more complicated than that, and James knew it. His engagement to Vivian was part of a larger tapestry, family expectations, business connections, the merger his father had mentioned last night. The Ashford family controlled significant shares in 3 companies that complemented Montgomery Industries' portfolio. Still, something about yesterday had shaken something loose in James. For years, he'd been on autopilot, doing what was expected, following the path laid out for him. Good schools, good job, good marriage. When had he last done something because it felt right rather than because it was appropriate? His phone buzzed. A text from Vivian. Lunch at the club? Need to discuss honeymoon plans. He looked at it for a long moment before typing back. Can't today. Work emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. This felt urgent in a way that Vivian's honeymoon planning never would. "Richard, I need you to do something else for me," James said. "Find out who the best early childhood music education specialists are in the area. People who work with gifted children. And find out what it would cost to provide comprehensive music education for a 4-year-old, lessons, instruments, everything." "James," Richard said carefully, "I've worked for your family for 15 years. I've never questioned your judgment. But I need to ask, what exactly are you planning here?" James met his eyes. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet. But I watched that little girl play yesterday, and I saw something pure in it. Something real. In our world, Richard, how often do we encounter something that's completely genuine?" Richard nodded slowly. "Not often enough. But you need to be careful. If you approach this the wrong way, you could spook Elena Martinez. A wealthy man suddenly taking an interest in her daughter? That could look predatory, suspicious." "I know." James ran a hand through his hair. "That's why I need to think this through carefully." After Richard left, James sat in his office for a long time, thinking. He pulled up YouTube on his computer and searched for the Chopin nocturne Sophie had played. He found a performance by a renowned concert pianist and listened, remembering the way Sophie's small hands had moved across the keys. She'd made mistakes, certainly. Her timing wasn't perfect, her fingers stumbled in places. But the emotional core of the piece had been there, this sense of understanding that transcended technique. His mother would have wept to hear it. The thought came unbidden, and with it, a wave of grief that James usually kept carefully compartmentalized. Caroline Montgomery had died of a sudden stroke when James was 12. Before that, she'd been a force of nature, a concert pianist who'd toured with major orchestras before choosing to marry his father and retire from public performance. She'd still played, though, every day, and she'd tried to teach James. He'd resisted. At 12, he'd been more interested in sports, in fitting in with his friends, in everything except the thing his mother loved most. They'd argued about it the week before she died. He'd refused to practice, had said cruel things about her wasting her life on music. He'd never gotten to apologize. For 20 years, that piano had sat in the music room, maintained but rarely played. James would sometimes hear the housekeeping staff dusting it, and each time, the sound of keys being wiped down felt like a small death. Until yesterday, when a 4-year-old girl had brought it back to life. His phone rang. His father. "James, we need to talk about the Ashford merger. Can you come by the house this evening?" "Of course," James said automatically. "And bring Vivian. Her father wants to hammer out some details about the joint venture." After he hung up, James sat back in his chair. This was his life. Obligations, expectations, the weight of the Montgomery name and fortune. He'd been raised for this, had accepted it as his destiny. But for the first time in a very long time, he wondered if there might be room for something else. Something that mattered in a way that mergers and acquisitions never would. Meanwhile, across town in Stamford, Elena sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her phone. Mrs. Chun had called that morning. "Elena, I need to talk to you about yesterday," the head housekeeper had said, her voice careful. Elena's heart had sunk. "Mrs. Chun, I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. I'll make sure." "That's not why I'm calling," Mrs. Chun interrupted. "Mr. Montgomery wants to see you. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at the estate. He said it's about Sophie." Elena had felt ice in her veins. "What about Sophie?" "He didn't say. Just that it's important and that you should bring her." Now, 24 hours later, Elena was terrified. What could James Montgomery possibly want with her daughter? Vivian's accusations yesterday kept echoing in her mind. Scheme, trick, taking advantage. Was he going to accuse her of something? Threaten her somehow? Sophie was in the living room, singing to herself while coloring. She was always singing or humming, always finding melodies in everything. Elena watched her daughter and felt the familiar ache of loving someone so much it physically hurt. She'd give Sophie the world if she could. Instead, all she could offer was a one-bedroom apartment, thrift store clothes, and a mother who worked herself to exhaustion just to keep them afloat. Sophie looked up and smiled, the expression so pure and joyful it made Elena's eyes burn. "Mama, look. I drawed the pretty piano." Elena went to look. Sophie had drawn the Steinway in crayon, brown and black, with careful attention to the keys. It wasn't just a child's scribble. It showed genuine observation, genuine care. "It's beautiful, baby," Elena whispered. "Can we go see it again?" "Maybe," Elena said, though she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Elena allowed herself to cry, quiet tears that she muffled in her pillow. She was so tired. Tired of being strong, of scraping by, of seeing her brilliant daughter's potential and being powerless to help her reach it. But by morning, she'd pulled herself together. Whatever James Montgomery wanted, she'd face it head-on. She'd protected Sophie from everything life had thrown at them so far. She wouldn't stop now. She dressed Sophie in her best outfit, a dress from Target that was only slightly too small, and braided her hair carefully. She wore her own best clothes, the ones she saved for parent-teacher conferences and job interviews. As they took the bus toward Greenwich, Sophie chattered excitedly about seeing the castle again. Elena held her hand and prayed she wasn't leading her daughter into something that would break both their hearts. The meeting wasn't in the grand music room where everything had happened. Instead, Mrs. Chun led Elena and Sophie to a smaller sitting room off the main foyer, still opulent by any normal standard, with its antique furniture and oil paintings, but somehow more intimate. James Montgomery stood when they entered. He was dressed more casually than Elena had ever seen him, dark jeans and a button-down shirt, no tie. It made him seem younger, more approachable, though no less intimidating. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming," he said, his voice formal but not cold. "Please sit down." Elena perched on the edge of a cream-colored settee, pulling Sophie onto her lap, protectively. "Mr. Montgomery, if this is about yesterday, I want you to know." "It is about yesterday," he interrupted gently, "but probably not in the way you're thinking." He glanced at Sophie, who was staring at him with open curiosity. "Hello, Sophie. Do you remember me?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "You're the nice man. The other lady was mean." A flash of something amusement? Sadness crossed James's face. "Yes, well, I apologize for that." "What's apologize mean?" Sophie asked. "It means I'm sorry," James said. "And I am. You didn't do anything wrong." Elena's arms tightened around her daughter. "Mr. Montgomery, please just tell me why we're here. Are you firing me?"
What? No.
He looked genuinely shocked.
God, no.
"Ms. Martinez, Elena, if I may, I asked you here because I wanted to talk to you about Sophie's gift." Elena felt her stomach drop. Here it came, the accusation, the suspicion that she was trying to exploit the situation somehow. But what James said next wasn't what she expected at all. "I'd like to help her develop it.
Properly.
With the best teachers, the best resources." The words seemed to hang in the air. Elena stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What?" James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "What Sophie did yesterday, playing Chopin at 4 years old, without lessons, that's extraordinary. My mother was a concert pianist. She taught me enough about music that I can recognize genuine prodigy-level talent when I see it. Sophie has that talent." Elena's mind was reeling. "I know she's musical, but this is beyond musical," James said. "This is the kind of gift that comes along once in a generation. And it would be a crime to let it go undeveloped just because of," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because of circumstances." "Circumstances," Elena repeated, the word tasting bitter. That was a polite way of saying poverty. "I have the resources to help," James continued. "I'd like to arrange for Sophie to be assessed by a specialist in early childhood music education. If the assessment confirms what I suspect, and I believe it will, I'd like to provide comprehensive music education for her. Piano lessons with a master teacher, music theory, everything she needs. Elena felt like she'd been dropped into an alternate reality. Mr. Montgomery, I can't afford. I'm not asking you to pay for anything, he said quickly. This would be... He paused again, and Elena saw him struggling with how to frame it. Think of it as a scholarship. An investment in talent. Why? The question came out sharper than Elena intended. Why would you do this? You don't know us. We're nothing to you. James was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. My mother died when I was 12. Before that, she tried to teach me piano. I resisted. I thought it was a waste of time, that sports and friends were more important. We fought about it the week before her stroke. I never got to apologize, never got to tell her I was sorry for not appreciating what she was trying to give me. He looked at Sophie, who was now playing with the hem of her dress, half listening to the adult conversation. When I saw your daughter play yesterday, I saw something my mother would have recognized immediately. Something precious. And I thought about all the gifts that get lost in this world because circumstances, yes, circumstances, prevent them from being nurtured. I can't bring my mother back, but I can make sure that one extraordinarily gifted child gets the chance she deserves. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes. It was a beautiful sentiment, truly. But she'd learned long ago that beautiful sentiments didn't pay rent or put food on the table. And they certainly didn't come from billionaires without strings attached. What do you want in return? She asked quietly. James blinked. In return? Nobody gives something for nothing, Mr. Montgomery. Especially not people with money. So what's the catch? What do you expect from us? For a moment he looked almost hurt. Then understanding crossed his face. You think this is some kind of trick? I think I've learned to be careful, Elena said. I have to protect my daughter. So, yes, I need to know, what are you really asking for? James sat back, and Elena saw him reassessing her. Good. Let him see that she wasn't some naive fool who'd be dazzled by his wealth and generosity. I'm asking for nothing, he said finally, except the chance to see Sophie's talent developed. I won't lie, there would be some publicity involved eventually. If she's as gifted as I think, her teachers will want to enter her in competitions, maybe arrange recitals. The Montgomery name attached to that would be good for my family's foundation work. But that's years away, if it happens at all. So we'd owe you, Elena said flatly.
No.
James's voice was firm now. Let me be absolutely clear. This would be set up as an educational trust for Sophie, managed by independent trustees. You'd have input into every decision about her education. If at any time you're uncomfortable or want to end the arrangement, you can. The only thing I'd ask is that Sophie be given the opportunity to reach her full potential. Elena looked down at her daughter, who was now humming softly to herself, a melody Elena recognized from the classical music station she sometimes played in the car. I need time to think about this, she said. Of course, James said immediately. I understand this is a lot to process. But would you at least agree to have Sophie assessed? There's a professor at Manhattan School of Music, Dr. Sarah Chin, no relation to Mrs. Chin, who specializes in gifted young children. She could evaluate Sophie, give you an objective opinion of her abilities. No commitment beyond that. And this assessment, you'd pay for it? Yes. Elena was silent, her mind working through possibilities and pitfalls. Finally, Sophie looked up at her. Mama, is he talking about piano playing? Yes, baby. I like piano playing, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Then, to James. Do you have a piano I can play? James smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less intimidating. I do. Would you like to play it now? Before Elena could object, Sophie had scrambled off her lap. Yes, please. James stood and held out his hand. Sophie took it without hesitation, her tiny hand disappearing in his. He glanced at Elena. Is this okay? No, Elena's protective instinct screamed. Don't let your daughter out of your sight with this stranger, no matter how rich or well-intentioned he seems. But Sophie was already pulling James toward the door, chattering about the pretty piano she'd seen before, and Elena found herself following, her heart in her throat. The music room looked different in the morning light. The chandeliers were off, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, making the Steinway gleam. Sophie gasped with delight and ran to it. "Can I? Please?" she asked, looking between James and Elena. "Go ahead," James said softly. Sophie climbed onto the bench and immediately began to play. Not the Chopin from yesterday, but something else, a piece Elena didn't recognize. It was simpler but no less beautiful, filled with a lightness that matched Sophie's nature. "Where did she learn that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "I've never heard it before." "She's improvising," James said, wonder in his voice. "She's making it up as she goes." They watched as Sophie played, her small face scrunched in concentration, her fingers finding notes with an instinct that defied explanation. When she finished, she looked back at them expectantly. "That was beautiful, Mija," Elena said, her voice thick. "This is what I'm talking about," James said urgently. "Elena, this isn't normal talent. This is something special. Something that deserves to be nurtured." Elena looked at her daughter, really looked at her. Sophie was smiling, her whole face lit up with joy in a way Elena rarely saw. In their small apartment, with its thin walls and cramped spaces, there was no room for a piano. Sophie's gift was something that existed in stolen moments, in shopping mall lobbies, in the music room at the daycare before it closed, in hummed melodies that filled their tiny home. What kind of mother would Elena be if she denied her daughter this chance out of pride or fear? But what kind of mother would she be if she trusted too easily and let her daughter get hurt? "I'll agree to the assessment," Elena said finally. "But I have conditions." James turned to her, his expression serious. "Name them." "Everything goes through me. Every decision about Sophie's education, her schedule, her teachers, I have final say. And if at any point I feel this isn't in her best interest, it stops. No questions asked." "Agreed. And I don't want charity. If you're going to do this, I want it done properly, legally, with contracts and everything in writing. I want to understand exactly what you're committing to and what's expected of us. I'll have my lawyer draw up something for you to review. You should probably get your own lawyer to look at it too." Elena almost laughed. "Mr. Montgomery, I can barely afford groceries. I definitely can't afford a lawyer." "Then I'll pay for one. An independent one, someone who represents only your interests." He held up a hand before she could protest. "That's non-negotiable. If we're going to do this, I want you to feel completely comfortable with every aspect of it." Elena studied him, trying to understand what motivated this man. He didn't look at Sophie with the predatory interest she'd feared. He looked at her with something like reverence, the way one might look at a priceless work of art, or the way Elena's own mother used to look at Elena when she was proud of her. "Okay," Elena said quietly. "We'll do the assessment." "Thank you," James said, and he sounded genuinely grateful, as if she were doing him the favor rather than the other way around. At the piano, Sophie had started playing again, this time a version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, with elaborate variations that she was clearly inventing on the spot. "She's remarkable," James said softly. "I know," Elena replied. "She's everything to me. I understand. And I promise you, I'm going to do everything in my power to help her shine." As they left the Montgomery estate an hour later, Sophie holding Elena's hand and skipping happily, Elena's mind was churning. She'd just agreed to let a billionaire she barely knew become involved in her daughter's life. It either the best decision she'd ever made or the biggest mistake. Only time would tell which. But as they waited for the bus, and Sophie hummed the melody she'd improvised, Elena allowed herself a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her daughter was going to get the chance Elena had always dreamed of giving her. As their bus pulled away, Elena didn't see James standing at his office window, watching them go. And she didn't see Vivian's Mercedes pull up to the estate, the blonde woman's face twisted with fury as Mrs. Chen quietly informed her that James had spent the morning with that woman and her child. The storm that was coming would test everything. But in that moment, Elena allowed herself to hope. Dr. Sarah Chen's office at the Manhattan School of Music was a warm, cluttered space filled with books, musical scores, and photographs of children at pianos. Elena sat in a comfortable chair, her hands clenched at her lap, while through the glass window of the practice room, she could see Sophie at a piano with Dr. Chen beside her. They'd been in there for 2 hours. James sat in another chair, equally tense despite his attempts to appear relaxed. He'd offered to wait outside, to give Elena space, but she'd asked him to stay. If this was going to be their arrangement, whatever it turned out to be, she needed to be able to tolerate his presence. The door finally opened, and Dr. Chen emerged. She was a petite woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a bun. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Elena could see the excitement underneath. "Well?" Elena asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. Dr. Chen sat down across from them and pulled out a folder. "In 25 years of working with musically gifted children, I've never seen anything quite like Sophie." Elena felt her heart stutter. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Chen said carefully, "that your daughter has what we call perfect pitch, the ability to identify and reproduce any note she hears. That alone is rare, occurring in maybe 1 in 10,000 people. But Sophie has something beyond that. She has an intuitive understanding of harmonic structure that most trained musicians take years to develop. And her ability to improvise, to create variations on themes she's just heard, suggests a compositional gift as well." "So she's what?" "Gifted." Elena's voice was small. "Profoundly so," Dr. Chen confirmed. "In technical terms, I'd classify her as exhibiting prodigy-level talent. If properly nurtured, she could potentially reach the highest levels of musical achievement." Elena felt dizzy. "What does properly nurtured mean?" Dr. Chen leaned forward. "It means regular lessons with a master teacher, daily practice, exposure to a wide range of musical styles and periods, music theory education, and eventually performance opportunities. It means treating music not as a hobby, but as a serious discipline." "That sounds expensive," Elena said quietly. "It is," Dr. Chen agreed. "A comprehensive program of the type Sophie needs could easily run $50,000 to $70,000 a year, and that's before you factor in instruments, sheet music, competition fees, and travel." Elena felt sick. Those numbers were meaningless to her. She made $32,000 a year across all her jobs. 50,000 might as well be 50 million. James spoke for the first time. "Money isn't an issue. I told Elena I'd provide whatever Sophie needs." Dr. Chen looked between them, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Montgomery, may I be frank? Please. I've worked with wealthy benefactors before. Some have good intentions, some don't. Before we go any further, I need to understand what you're hoping to gain from this arrangement." James didn't hesitate. "I want to see Sophie reach her full potential. That's all." "That's never all," Dr. Chen said gently. "There's always more to it. Prestige? Tax benefits? The satisfaction of playing kingmaker?" Elena watched James's face, curious how he'd respond to such direct questioning. "All of those things probably," he admitted. "I'm not going to pretend to be purely altruistic. Yes, there would be prestige in being associated with an emerging prodigy. Yes, it would reflect well on my family's foundation work." But he paused, seeming to search for words. "Have you ever seen something so precious that letting it be lost would feel like a personal failure? That's what I felt when I heard Sophie play. Like I'd been given a chance to preserve something rare and beautiful, and saying no would haunt me forever." Dr. Chin studied him for a long moment. Then she turned to Elena. And you, Ms. Martinez? How do you feel about this? Elena took a shaky breath. Terrified, grateful, suspicious, hopeful, all of it at once. She looked at James. I don't trust easily, Dr. Chin. I've learned that people don't do things for free, especially people with money. But I've also learned that sometimes you have to take risks for your children. If this gives Sophie a chance I could never give her on my own. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Dr. Chin nodded slowly. Here's what I'm going to recommend. If we move forward, I'd like to be involved in the structure of Sophie's education. Not just as a teacher, but as an advocate. Someone who ensures the focus stays on what's best for Sophie as a child and as a musician, not on what's convenient for the adults involved. I'd like that, Elena said immediately. As would I, James agreed.
Good.
Then let's talk logistics. Dr. Chin pulled out several sheets of paper. Sophie needs to start lessons immediately. Her critical development window is now. I'd recommend my colleague, Professor David Liu, as her primary piano instructor. He's worked with several prodigy-level students and has a gentle touch with young children. 3 lessons a week to start, 30 minutes each. That's a lot, Elena said uncertainly. It has to be at this stage. We need to build proper technique before she develops bad habits. But we also need to keep it fun, keep her love of music alive. That's the hardest balance with gifted children, pushing them to develop their talent without crushing their joy. They talked for another hour, mapping out a preliminary plan. Lessons would start next week. James would purchase a piano for Sophie to practice on. Dr. Chin recommended a quality upright rather than a grand, something that would fit in Elena's apartment. Wait, Elena interrupted. My apartment is rent-controlled. I'd need permission from my landlord to bring in a piano. I'll handle it, James said. If necessary, I'll pay for soundproofing or compensate the neighbors for any noise. You can't just throw money at every problem, Elena said, frustrated. Why not? James asked genuinely. If money can solve a problem, and I have it, why wouldn't I use it? It was such a perfect illustration of their different worlds that Elena almost laughed. For him, problems were things money could fix. For her, money was usually the problem. Dr. Chen intervened gently. Why don't I make some calls? I know landlords in the area who are sympathetic to young musicians. We might be able to find a solution that doesn't involve throwing too much money at the situation. After the meeting, as they walked to the parking garage where James's driver waited, Sophie between them holding both their hands, Elena felt the weight of what was beginning. Mama, Dr. Chen says I'm going to learn lots of songs, Sophie said excitedly. She says maybe someday I can play in a big concert hall. Maybe, baby, Elena said softly. James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression darkened. I need to take this. Excuse me. He stepped away and Elena heard his voice low and tense. Vivian, I told you I was busy. No, that's not. We'll discuss this later. When he returned, he looked strained. I'm sorry about that. Your fiancé? Elena asked, even though she already knew.
Yes.
She's not happy about this arrangement. I gathered that from our first meeting, Elena said dryly. James ran a hand through his hair. Vivian comes from a very traditional background. She doesn't understand why I'm involving myself in. He stopped, seeming to realize how that sounded. In the life of your maid and her daughter? Elena finished coolly. That's not what I meant, but it's what she thinks, isn't it? Elena looked at him directly. Mr. Montgomery, I need to know, is your fiancé going to be a problem? Because if this is going to cause issues in your personal life, maybe we should reconsider. No, James said firmly. Vivian doesn't get to decide how I use my resources or who I choose to help. This isn't negotiable. There was steel in his voice that Elena hadn't heard before. It was simultaneously reassuring and worrying. If he was willing to defy his fiancée for Sophie, What else might he be willing to do? They reached the car, and James's driver opened the door. Can I give you both a ride home? Elena's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain some boundary between their worlds. But Sophie was tired, and the bus ride back to Stamford would take over an hour. Thank you, she said quietly. The drive was mostly silent. Sophie dozed against Elena's side while James sat across from them, looking out the window. When they pulled up to Elena's apartment building, a tired-looking complex with peeling paint and a broken playground, Elena saw James's expression tighten. Ms. Martinez, Elena, I hope you don't think I'm overstepping, but if you need better housing. No, Elena said firmly. The music lessons, the piano, the teachers, those are for Sophie, and I can accept them because they develop her gift. But I'm not a charity case, Mr. Montgomery. This is my home. It's small, and it's not fancy, but it's ours, and I pay for it with my own work. James held up his hands. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend. I know you didn't, but we need to establish boundaries. You're helping with Sophie's music education. That's it. Everything else about our lives stays separate. Understood. Elena unbuckled Sophie and gathered her into her arms. Thank you for today. For everything. It's my privilege, James said, and he sounded like he meant it. As Elena carried Sophie up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, the elevator was broken again. She didn't see the black Mercedes that pulled up behind James's car. But James did. He sighed as Vivian emerged, her expression thunderous. So this is where she lives? Vivian said, looking at the building with undisguised contempt. My God, James, this is practically a slum. It's a rent-controlled apartment building, James said wearily. And what are you doing here, Vivian? Following you, apparently, since you've been avoiding my calls all day. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. We need to talk about this absurd situation. There's nothing absurd about it. You're spending your time and money on a housekeeper's bastard child. Don't. James's voice was ice. Don't you dare talk about her that way. Vivian's eyes widened slightly at his tone. James, be reasonable. I understand you're having some kind of midlife crisis or guilt trip about your mother, but you can't let it cloud your judgment. This woman is obviously taking advantage of you. Elena hasn't asked me for anything. If anything, she's been resistant to accepting help. Of course she has, Vivian exclaimed. That's the long con, darling. She plays hard to get, you chase, and before you know it, she's asking for more and more. A bigger apartment, a car, maybe a loan she never has to repay. This is manipulation 101. James looked at his fiancée, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside him. Do you hear yourself? You're so convinced everyone has an ulterior motive that you can't imagine someone might just be trying to do their best for their child. I'm protecting you, Vivian insisted. Someone has to. Your parents would be horrified if they knew you were getting involved with a help like this. My mother would have loved Sophie, James said quietly. She would have recognized her gift immediately and moved heaven and earth to help her develop it. Your mother was a sentimental woman who gave up a promising career to play housewife, Vivian said dismissively. Is that really the example you want to follow? The words hung in the air between them. James felt something inside him crack. Get in your car, Vivian, he said quietly. James. Get in your car and go home. We'll talk later, when you've calmed down. I am calm, but she was practically shouting. A few residents of the building had appeared on their balconies, watching the scene unfold. Please, James said. Just go. Vivian's face cycled through several emotions: anger, disbelief, calculation. Finally, she drew herself up.
Fine.
But this conversation isn't over. And this situation with that woman and her child? It needs to end, James. Before you embarrass yourself and our families any further. She swept back to her car and drove off, tires squealing. James stood there for a long moment, aware he was being watched from multiple windows. Then he got into his own car. Home, sir, his driver asked.
Yes. No.
I don't know. James rubbed his face. Just drive for a bit, Michael. I need to think. As they drove through Stamford streets, past bodegas and laundromats and people living lives so different from his own, James thought about what Dr. Chen had asked. What did he hope to gain from this? The truth was more complicated than he'd admitted. Yes, he wanted to help Sophie. Yes, he felt connected to this through his mother's memory. But there was something else, something he was only beginning to acknowledge. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Not a business deal, not a social obligation, not another chess piece moved on the board of acceptable behavior. Something real. And if that meant confronting Vivian's prejudices, his family's expectations, and his own comfortable assumptions about the way the world worked, then so be it. Up in her apartment, Elena tucked Sophie into bed and then stood at her window, looking out at the parking lot where James's car had been. She thought about Dr. Chen's assessment, about the program they'd outlined, about the future that was suddenly opening up for her daughter. And she thought about Vivian's face in that music room, twisted with contempt. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be conflicts, complications, maybe even heartbreak. But as she looked at her sleeping daughter, this beautiful, gifted, miraculous child, Elena knew she'd walk through fire to give her this chance. Whatever storms were coming, they'd weather them together. 3 months had passed since that first assessment, and Elena's life had become something she barely recognized. The piano, a beautiful Yamaha upright that James had insisted was modest despite its $15,000 price tag, now dominated their small living room. Professor Liu came 3 times a week, his gentle patience with Sophie a constant source of wonder. Dr. Chen checked in regularly, monitoring Sophie's progress and ensuring the balance between development and childhood joy was maintained. And Sophie was blooming. Elena stood in the doorway now, watching her daughter practice. Sophie's small fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, working through a Bach prelude that Professor Liu had assigned. When she made a mistake, she'd stop, go back, work through it again. The discipline was developing naturally, not forced. "Mama, listen to this," Sophie called, and launched into a piece Elena didn't recognize, because Sophie was making it up, her improvisation growing more sophisticated each week. "Beautiful, Mija," Elena said, her heart full. Her phone buzzed. A text from James. "Recital on Saturday. Sophie's ready. Are you?" Elena smiled. The recital was for Professor Liu's young students, nothing major, but it would be Sophie's first public performance. She was going to play a simplified Mozart sonata and one of her own compositions, a short piece she called Mama's Song. Elena texted back. She was born ready.
Me?
Ask me Saturday. The truth was, Elena was terrified. Not of Sophie performing. Her daughter had no fear whatsoever when it came to music, but of what it meant, this new world they were entering. Already, other parents at the music school looked at them with curiosity, having heard whispers about the prodigy, studying with Professor Liu. There was a knock at the door. Elena opened it to find James standing there with bags from an expensive grocery store. "You don't have to keep doing this," Elena said, exasperated, even as she stepped aside to let him in. "Doing what?" James asked innocently, beginning to unpack fresh fruits, quality meats, the kind of food Elena could never afford on her own.
This.
She gestured at the bags. The groceries, the new winter coat that mysteriously appeared in Sophie's closet, Sophie needs good nutrition to support her brain development, James said reasonably. And it's winter. She needed a warm coat. I'm her mother. Providing those things is my job. James stopped unpacking and looked at her directly. "Elena, can I be honest with you? Have you been dishonest?" "No, but..." "Look, I know this arrangement is complicated. I know you value your independence, and I respect that. But watching Sophie develop, seeing her gift unfold, it's been..." He paused, searching for words. "It's been one of the most meaningful things I've ever been part of. Let me do this." Not because you need charity, but because it gives me purpose. Elena studied him. In 3 months, she'd come to know James Montgomery in ways that surprised her. He wasn't what she'd expected. He showed up to Sophie's lessons when his schedule allowed, always asking intelligent questions, genuinely interested in her progress. He'd learned her favorite foods, her bedtime routine, the way she liked her hair braided. And his relationship with Vivian seemed to be crumbling. "How is your fiancé?" Elena asked, softening slightly. James's expression darkened. "We're taking some time apart. She doesn't understand why I'm wasting my time on this project." Project? Elena's voice sharpened. "Her word, not mine," James said quickly. "Elena, you have to know that's not how I see this. How I see either of you." "Then how do you see us?" It was a bold question, maybe too bold, but these months had eroded some of the careful distance Elena had tried to maintain. They'd shared too many moments: Sophie's first successful performance of a difficult passage, the tears when she got frustrated, the joy when everything clicked. They'd become something like partners in Sophie's development, and that intimacy had created a bond Elena hadn't anticipated. James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I see a little girl with a gift that makes the world more beautiful. And I see a woman who would do anything to protect her child, who works 3 jobs and never complains, who's the strongest person I've ever met." The words hung in the air between them. Elena felt her breath catch. "Mr. Montgomery, I think after 3 months, you can call me James." "James," she said, testing the name. We can't." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not suggesting, I'm still engaged."
Technically. And you work for my family.
"And our circumstances are completely different. I know all of that. But," Elena prompted, because she could hear the unspoken word. "But sometimes I wish things were different," James admitted. "Sometimes I wish I'd met you another way, in another life, where all these complications didn't exist." Before Elena could respond, Sophie came running in. "James, did you bring more of those cookies?" The moment broke. James laughed and pulled out a box of Sophie's favorite shortbread. "I might have." Elena watched them together, Sophie chattering about the new piece she was learning, James listening with genuine interest, asking questions about the composer and the era, and felt something in her chest both expand and ache. This couldn't continue. Not like this. It was too complicated, too dangerous to her heart and to the fragile stability they'd built. But how could she end it when Sophie was so happy, when her daughter's gift was finally being nurtured the way it deserved? The recital on Saturday was held in a small concert hall on the music school's campus. It wasn't fancy, maybe 100 seats, half of them filled with proud parents and grandparents. But to Elena, walking in with Sophie's hand in hers, it felt like Carnegie Hall. James had offered to pick them up, but Elena had insisted on taking the train. She needed some boundaries, some reminder that this was Sophie's achievement, not something bought and paid for by Montgomery money. But when they arrived, James was there anyway, standing near the entrance. He'd brought flowers, a small bouquet of daisies, Sophie's favorite. "For the star of the evening," he said, kneeling to Sophie's level. Sophie beamed and buried her face in the flowers. "They smell like sunshine." "That's exactly what I thought," James said, smiling. Then, to Elena, "Is it okay that I'm here?" "Of course," Elena said, though her heart was hammering. "Sophie would have been disappointed if you weren't." They found seats together, and Elena tried not to notice how natural it felt, the 3 of them sitting side by side like a family. She tried not to notice the looks from other parents, the whispered speculation. Then Sophie's turn came. Her daughter walked onto the small stage in a simple white dress, not fancy, but clean and pressed. She climbed onto the piano bench, adjusted it carefully the way Professor Liu had taught her, and placed her hands on the keys. The room fell silent. Sophie played the Mozart first, her small hands navigating the classical piece with a maturity that belied her age. There were a few small stumbles, but she worked through them without panic, just as she'd been taught. Then came Mama's song. Elena had heard it dozens of times during practice, but hearing it now in this space, with an audience bearing witness, was different. The piece was simple, just a few minutes long, but it captured something essential about their life together. The struggles, yes, but also the love, the hope, the small joys that sustained them. When Sophie finished, the applause was thunderous for such a small crowd. Sophie stood and bowed, beaming, and Elena realized she was crying. James's hand found hers, squeezed gently. "She's incredible." "I know," Elena whispered. After the recital, several people approached them. Dr. Chun introduced them to other faculty members, to parents of other talented students. Everyone wanted to talk about Sophie's gift, her potential, her future. And through it all, Elena noticed how James stayed close, not possessive but protective, deflecting the more invasive questions, creating space for Sophie when she got overwhelmed. It was nearly 9 o'clock when they finally made it outside. Sophie was exhausted, practically asleep on her feet. "Let me drive you home," James said.
Please.
"It's late, and she's tired." Elena was too wrung out emotionally to argue. In the car, Sophie fell asleep almost immediately, curled up on the seat beside Elena. "She was amazing tonight," James said softly as they drove through the darkened streets. "She was," Elena agreed. "James, I've been thinking." "That sounds ominous." Elena took a breath. "This arrangement, it's working. Better than I ever imagined. Sophie is thriving, and I'm grateful. More grateful than I can express. I hear a but coming. But I'm worried about blurred lines. About what happens when this isn't just about music lessons and education anymore." James was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. Vivian and I broke off our engagement last week. Officially." Elena's heart lurched. "James." "It wasn't because of you," he said quickly. "Or not just because of you. It was because she made me see how miserable I'd been, how much of my life I'd been living on autopilot, doing what was expected rather than what felt right. She wanted me to give up this ridiculous project with Sophie. Said I was embarrassing our families, wasting my time on people who didn't matter." "And what did you say?" "I said that Sophie and her music education matter more to me than any business merger or social connection ever could. I said that for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something worthwhile. And I said that if she couldn't understand that, we had no business getting married." Elena felt dizzy. "You ended your engagement over us?" "Over a principle," James corrected. "Over the realization that I was about to marry someone whose values I don't share. You and Sophie, you just helped me see it clearly." They'd reached Elena's apartment. James parked but didn't move to get out. "I'm not expecting anything from you," he said quietly. "I know our situations are complicated. I know I'm still your employer's son, that there's a massive power imbalance, that people would talk. But I want you to know that what started as honoring my mother's memory has become something more. You've become important to me. Both of you." Elena looked at her sleeping daughter, then back at James. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." Elena made a decision. "Come upstairs. Help me get her to bed, and then we need to talk." In the apartment, they worked together to change Sophie into her pajamas and tuck her in. Elena watched James read her daughter a bedtime story, his voice soft and gentle, and felt something crack open in her chest. When Sophie was asleep, they sat at Elena's small kitchen table with tea. "I'm scared," Elena admitted, "of what this could become, of what people will say, of the power you have to hurt us if this goes wrong." "I would never." "I know you wouldn't intentionally. But James, look at our worlds. You live in a mansion. I live in a one-bedroom apartment. You're a billionaire. I clean houses for a living. How could this ever work?" "I don't know," James said honestly. But I know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I know that Sophie has brought more joy into my life in 3 months than I've felt in 3 years. That has to mean something. Elena was quiet for a long time. If we do this, and I'm not saying we are, but if we do, there have to be rules. Sophie comes first, always. Her education, her well-being, her happiness. This can't interfere with that. Agreed. And we go slow, really slow. Because if this falls apart, I need to know that Sophie's music education continues regardless. That has to be separate from whatever happens between us personally. I'll have the trust restructured to ensure that, James said immediately. Independent trustees, guaranteed funding through her 18th birthday at minimum. Whatever happens between us, Sophie's education is protected. Okay, Elena said, her heart pounding. Then, okay. James's face transformed. Okay, we can see where this goes.
Carefully.
Slowly. He reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip gentle. I promise I'll do everything I can to be worthy of this chance. Elena looked at their joined hands, rough and soft, working class and privileged, but somehow fitting together. So will I, she whispered. 6 months later, Elena stood in the wings of Alice Tully Hall at Lincoln Center, watching her 5-year-old daughter perform for an audience of music industry professionals, critics, and donors to the newly established Montgomery Foundation for Young Musicians. Sophie was playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, the same piece she'd first learned from Elena's humming, but now with the technique and understanding of someone far beyond her years. The performance was flawless, emotional, breathtaking. Beside Elena, James squeezed her hand. They'd been dating officially for 3 months now, though they'd kept it quiet, careful. But tonight, his family was here. His father, who'd initially been skeptical but had softened after hearing Sophie play. His older sister, who'd become one of Sophie's biggest champions. Even Mrs. Chun was here, tears streaming down her face as she watched the little girl she'd met in a hallway become something extraordinary. When Sophie finished, the applause was thunderous. She stood and bowed, then looked into the wings, directly at Elena and James, and smiled. In that moment, Elena thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, exhausted, frightened, certain that her daughter's gift would go unnurtured because she couldn't afford to help her. She thought about Vivian's contempt, her certainty that people like Elena were just looking for handouts. And she thought about James, who'd seen past all of that to something precious and rare. Thank you, Elena whispered to him. For what? For seeing her, really seeing her. James pulled her close. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Part of both your lives. On stage, Sophie was being presented with flowers by Dr. Chen. The little girl buried her face in them, just as she had at her first recital, and said something that made the audience laugh. Later, at the reception, a renowned music critic approached them. Ms. Martinez, Mr. Montgomery, that was extraordinary. Your daughter is going to change the face of classical music. Our daughter, James corrected gently, then looked at Elena with a question in his eyes. Elena's breath caught. They hadn't talked about marriage yet, about making their unconventional family official. But standing there, watching Sophie charm a room full of New York's cultural elite while somehow remaining completely herself, Elena knew what her answer would be when he asked. Yes, she said softly. Our daughter. Sophie ran up to them then, throwing her arms around both their legs. Did I do good? Elena knelt down, pulling her daughter close. You did perfect, baby. You always do. That's because I have the best mama, Sophie declared. Then looking at James. And the best James. How about the best dad? James suggested carefully. Sophie's eyes went wide. In that moment, Elena thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, exhausted, frightened, certain that her daughter's gift would go unnurtured because she couldn't afford to help her. She thought about Vivian's contempt, her certainty that people like Elena were just looking for handouts. And she thought about James, who'd seen past all of that to something precious and rare. "Thank you," Elena whispered to him. "For what?" "For seeing her. Really seeing her." James pulled her close. "Thank you for letting me be part of this. Part of both your lives." On stage, Sophie was being presented with flowers by Dr. Chen. The little girl buried her face in them, just as she had at her first recital, and said something that made the audience laugh. Later, at the reception, a renowned music critic approached them. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Montgomery, that was extraordinary. Your daughter is going to change the face of classical music." "Our daughter," James corrected gently, then looked at Elena with a question in his eyes. Elena's breath caught. They hadn't talked about marriage yet, about making their unconventional family official. But standing there, watching Sophie charm a room full of New York's cultural elite while somehow remaining completely herself, Elena knew what her answer would be when he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "Our daughter." Sophie ran up to them then, throwing her arms around both their legs. "Did I do good?" Elena knelt down, pulling her daughter close. "You did perfect, baby. You always do." "That's because I have the best mama," Sophie declared. Then, looking at James, "And the best James." "How about the best dad?" James suggested carefully. Sophie's eyes went wide. "Really? You'd be my dad, if that's okay with you. And with your mom." Sophie looked at Elena, who nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," Sophie squealed, jumping into James's arms. Around them, the reception continued, but for Elena, the world had narrowed to this moment, her daughter in the arms of the man who'd helped them both find wings to fly, the three of them together, a family forged not by blood or circumstance, but by love and music and the courage to believe in second chances. A year ago, Vivian had laughed at the maid's daughter, certain she was nothing special. How wrong she'd been. Sophie wasn't just special. She was extraordinary. And Elena had learned that the most precious gifts often come from the most unexpected places, not from wealth or status, but from the courage to see past differences to the humanity underneath. As photographers captured the moment and critics whispered about the next great prodigy, Elena closed her eyes and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. They'd weathered the storm. And on the other side, they'd found something more beautiful than she'd ever imagined possible. They'd found each other. And they'd found home. The end.